The lower residential bar on Keth Station's commercial level had been open for 11 years, which was the specific tenure of a bar that had found its clientele, and its clientele had found it, and the finding had been mutual enough to sustain 11 years of evenings. The owner had calibrated the lighting to the amber range that most species found appropriate for the specific, social function of a drinking establishment, which was the function of providing a place to be with other people in a way that did not require any particular outcome. And the amber lighting was the specific quality of a space that was inviting without being demanding, which was what the bar was and what it had been for 11 years. Grel Vor-Thana had been coming here for 4 months, which was the duration of his current Border Patrol rotation posting, and had found the bar in the first week with the specific, practical instinct of someone who knew that a bar near the residential section was a resource for a posting that had the specific, ongoing quality of long hours and the need for somewhere to put them afterward. He had found his way into the bar's social ecosystem in the way of someone who was good at finding their way into social ecosystems. The specific skill of recognizing what a room wanted and being willing to provide it, which was the skill of a good storyteller, which he was. The crowd at 2200 was the crowd the bar had on evenings when the Border Patrol's rotation schedule produced an overlap of off-duty personnel with the station's general residential population, which was the crowd that had the energy for an extended evening and the tolerance for extended company. He had been in the performance for 40 minutes, which was the amount of time that had built the crowd's investment to the level where the investment was self-sustaining, where the audience wanted the next thing because the preceding things had been good, and the wanting was its own momentum. The border skirmish stories were his best material. He had 4 years of them, the specific, accumulated experience of someone who had been in enough encounters to have the raw material for an evening, and the storytelling skill to make the raw material into something worth hearing. The humans had become, across the last year, the most productive subset of the material. The crowd responded to human stories in the way that crowds at border station bars responded to deathworld species stories, which was with the particular, compound interest of people who lived adjacent to the border themselves, and had the specific relationship with deathworld reputation that proximity produced, which was the relationship of wanting the reputation examined, and wanting the examination to find the reputation overstated. He gave them what they wanted. He gave it with the specific, professional care of someone who understood that giving an audience what it wanted was not lying. It was selecting from the available material the parts that served the function the material was supposed to serve, which was the function of the evening rather than the function of the historical record. The 17 kills had the specific, narrative weight of a number that was large enough to establish standing and specific enough to suggest authenticity. He had arrived at it across 4 years of careful accounting that included the encounters where his unit's action had produced the outcome, and his specific contribution was reconstructible, and the encounters where the reconstruction was less precise, and the encounters where the reconstruction was the reconstruction of someone who had been in a chaotic situation and had done their best to determine afterward what had happened and who had made it happen, which was the accounting that all Border Patrol veterans did, and which produced numbers that were honest in the general and specific in the way that specific was available, which was not always fully. He was describing the 16th in the specific, dramatic detail that the 16th deserved, the terrain, the light conditions, the human's approach, the outcome. When the corner booth's occupant stood up, he had noted the human when he came in. The noting had been the automatic kind, the surveying of a new space that produced the filing of its contents, the contents filed in the order of their apparent relevance, and the human in the corner booth had been filed as human, alone, corner position, not engaging. The not engaging quality was the quality of someone who was in the bar and not in the bar's social function, which was common enough, and the filing had not acquired additional annotations because the human had not given it anything to annotate. He was giving it something now. He stood with the unhurried quality of someone who had been sitting and had decided to stand, which was the complete account of the motion, nothing performed, nothing theatrical, the plain motion of someone who had made a decision and was beginning to execute it. Grel tracked him from the standing, because tracking something that was standing up and orienting toward you was the appropriate response, and his instincts were present even when his evening's mode was the performance mode. The human walked. The bar's noise reduced in the specific, involuntary way of a room's ambient sound, responding to its ambient attention reorganizing. Not a decision made by any individual in the bar, but the emergent behavior of a crowd that had collectively found something more immediately interesting than whatever it had individually been doing. The human stopped at the deliberate distance. He was not large in the immediately visible sense. He was the other kind, the kind that was present in the way he stood, the way the walk had been the walk it had been, the way his body occupied the space at the deliberate distance with the specific, settled quality of something that had found a position and did not need to adjust it. Grel's instincts were producing assessments faster than the performance mode had been producing material, which was the specific, clarifying quality of instincts that had been waiting for an appropriate input and had received one. The human said in standard without the performing quality of a challenge that was being performed, "You've killed 17 of my people. I'm standing right here. Make it 18. The bar completed its reduction. The silence was Grel's to fill, and he was not filling it. He was assessing, in the automatic way of someone whose training had produced assessment as the default response to the category of situation he was currently in. He was assessing the stance, the specific, economical position of someone whose default had become a trained position well enough that the default produced the training rather than the training producing the default, which was what happened when something had been practiced enough. He was assessing the breathing, the controlled quality of someone whose respiratory rate had not been elevated by a walk across a crowded bar to stand in front of a person who had been spending the evening describing killing that person's species, which was the respiratory rate of someone for whom this was not the exciting version of this situation, but the practical version. He was assessing the eyes, the specific, attending quality of eyes that were not performing watchfulness but were doing it, which was the difference between looking at someone because looking at them was the socially appropriate response to having challenged them, and looking at someone because looking at them was what you did when you were in the practical version of this situation, and the looking was for a purpose. Grel's assessment was producing a conclusion. The conclusion was not comfortable. The 17 kills had, across the evening's performance, been the number that established his standing and his material and his audience's investment, and they were the number that was his by the specific, careful accounting he had described. The accounting that was honest in the general and specific, in the way that specific was available in after-action reconstructions and battlefield confusions, and the general, ongoing problem of determining what happened in engagements that were not the clean, narrative encounters that made good material. The 17 had the weight of his actual service, and the weight of 4 years of border patrol, and the weight of the specific, real encounters that were the foundation of the number. And they also had, standing here in the specific, clarifying distance of a human who was offering to be the next one, a different quality than they had had 40 minutes ago. 40 minutes ago they had been a bar's evening material. They were, at this specific, clarifying distance, something else. He looked at the human looked at him. The looking was the attending kind, not the performing kind. And the specific, ongoing quality of the attending without the performing was the specific, useful information that the assessment had been building toward, which was the information that the human was not in this situation for the social function of the situation, not for the crowd, not for the resolution, not for the bar's collective attention, to witness something and redistribute to the appropriate parties. He was in it for what the statement had said he was in it for, which was the 18, Grel's assessment had a conclusion, and the conclusion was: the number 17 had served its purpose in the performance and was now serving a different purpose, which was the purpose of determining whether the human standing at the deliberate distance was going to accept the accounting at face value or was going to produce, in the specific, immediate way of someone who had made the calculation already and was waiting for the next step, the counter-accounting. He thought about the clean version of 17. He thought about the actual version. The silence was stretching. The crowd's attention was the weight of a room that had been watching a performance and was watching something else. And the something else was the specific, collective observation of whether the warrior who had been telling combat stories was going to be in a combat story or was going to be in a different kind of story. And both kinds were available. And the crowd knew both kinds were available, and the crowd was waiting. The Solvari woman at the adjacent table had been drinking since before Grel arrived. He had noted her in the initial survey: Solvari, alone, adjacent table, present in bar, and had filed her in the category of the corner booth's human, which was the category of people who were in the bar and not in the bar's social function, and had not updated the filing because she had given him nothing to update it with. She had been tracking the performance with the specific, focused attention of someone whose posture was not communicating the attention, but whose attention was fully present, which was a distinction that required paying a certain kind of attention to notice, and the performance mode was not the mode that paid that kind of attention. She stood. She stood with the unhurried authority of someone who had made a decision and was executing it, and she placed herself in the space between Grel and the human with the specific, deliberate placement of someone who was not intervening in the security sense, but was introducing a third element into a two-element situation. And the third element was her, and the quality she had, and the quality she had was the quality of someone who had done something like this before and knew what it was for. She looked at the human, the full, direct Solvari attention, the complete, undivided regard of a species for whom looking was not a partial act. She held it for the specific, sufficient interval of someone who was making sure the looking was received. She said, in standard, in the quiet register that the bar's complete silence made carrying without effort: "He's not worth the paperwork." She looked at Grel. She said, "And you, sit down, order something. And think very carefully about the difference between a story that costs you nothing and a story that costs you everything, because you have been fortunate enough to spend this evening on the side of the first kind." She sat down. She picked up her drink. She returned to the specific, private quality of someone who was doing the thing they had been doing before the interruption and was done with the interrupting. And the quality was complete in the way of something that was not performance, which was the same quality the human had had when he walked across the bar, and was the quality that seemed to be, in the Keth Station lower residential bar on this specific evening, the quality most worth attending to. Grel sat down. He sat down in the plain, deliberate way of someone making a visible decision, because the crowd was watching and the decision needed to be visible. And the decision was the one that the situation actually recommended when the situation was assessed correctly, which it was, and which he had been assessing since the human stood up. The decision was not comfortable in the way of decisions that were not the exciting version of the available options, but were the practical version. And the practical version was the one the assessment recommended, and the assessment was reliable. He had been in enough actual situations to know when the practical version was the right one. The human looked at the Solvari woman. He looked at Grel. He went back to the corner booth in the same unhurried quality he had come from it, and he sat down, and he was back in the quality he had been in before the standing. The specific, contained quality of someone who was present in the bar and not present in the bar's social function, which was the quality the evening had started with and was the quality the evening was returning to. The bar's noise began its return, not the dramatic return of a room releasing collective breath, the gradual, ambient return of a room whose collective attention had been released and was redistributing to the various individual functions it had been performing before the redistribution. The conversations resumed in the specific, tentative way of conversations that were resuming after an interruption, and were checking whether the resuming was appropriate before committing to it, and determining that it was, and committing. Grel looked at his drink. The drink was what it was, the specific, available thing in front of him, that was available to look at while he thought about the things that were available to think about, which were numerous, and which the Solvari woman had identified with the specific precision of someone who had been paying the kind of attention that his performance mode had not been paying. The first kind and the second kind. The story that cost nothing and the story that cost everything. He had been on the side of the first kind, and he was aware of the specific, clarifying fortune of that position in a way that, 40 minutes ago, he had not been aware of and would not have articulated if asked. He did not restart the storytelling. There was no story to tell that the evening had not already told, and the telling had been done without him and was better for it, which was the specific, useful quality of an education that arrived in the form of experience rather than instruction. He had the material he had, which was 4 years of border patrol and the actual encounters, and the actual accounting, and the actual number, which was the number the actual accounting produced when the accounting was honest in the way it needed to be honest in this specific, clarifying distance from the practical version, rather than the performance version. The Solvari woman signaled for another drink. She did it in the unhurried, specific gesture of someone who was in no hurry to be anywhere else, and was precisely where she intended to be. And the gesture was directed at the bar's staff, and not at anyone else in the room, which was the gesture of someone who was done with the evening's requiring, and was in the having a drink portion of the evening, which was what she had been in before the requiring had arrived. She had been on the station for 43 days. The posting was the posting, the specific, ongoing observation function that the Solvari 1st Combined Fleet's Intelligence Office had assigned to the transit corridor stations in the outer Confederacy systems, which was the function of being present and attending and noting and reporting, and which she had been doing for 43 days with the specific, patient quality of someone who had done this long enough to know that the useful evenings arrived in their own time, and were not producible by wanting them to arrive faster. The evening had been useful. The report would reflect that the Keth Border Patrol's storytelling culture had specific, documented tendencies that were relevant to the fleet commander's ongoing assessment of the border, coordination's operational reliability, and that the evening had also contained a piece of information about the human military presence on the station that was worth annotating, which was the information that the corner booth had been the corner booth of someone who had the specific, attending quality of the attending kind rather than the performing kind, and who had made a practical decision, and had allowed the practical decision to be interrupted by a third party without visible frustration, which was either the patience of someone who had been in the practical version enough times to know that the paperwork assessment was accurate, or the patience of someone who had assessed Grel's 17 and had arrived at the conclusion that Grel's 17 was the evening's material rather than the historical record, and had decided that the distinction was useful information and was going to let the evening produce it rather than the confrontation. She had not determined which. She was going to annotate both and let the fleet commander determine which was the relevant one. She finished her drink. She had another. The bar was what it was, which was the bar it had been for 11 years and was going to continue to be, which was the specific, amber-lit quality of a place that held evenings and let them go and held the next ones, and which was, on this specific evening, producing the specific, quiet aftermath of a room that had been in something and was now in the after of it, which was the most comfortable quality the room had found all evening. The corner booth was the corner booth. Grel's drink was in front of him, and he was not telling any stories. The Solvari woman's report was going to be filed in the morning, which was when reports were filed, and the morning was the morning that would come after this evening concluded, which it was doing in the specific, gradual way of evenings that had been what they were, and were arriving at the part where the being what they were was complete, and the rest was the rest. She did not look at either of them again. This was not dismissal in the social sense. It was the specific, practical quality of someone who had done what the evening required, and had received what the posting required, and was now in the having a drink portion, which needed nothing from either of them and did not involve them, which was the quality the evening had needed to arrive at and had arrived at, and which was sufficient. Outside, Keth Station was the station it always was. Inside, the bar was the bar.